an F&B and West Bank solution, but rather a FirstRand solution. So all of the franchises that we have under the FirstRand umbrella, including RMB, Direct Access, Motorvantage, our international as well as our African subs, have been exposed to this, this solution, if I want to put it that way. So, so we were very excited to share our journey. It's been quite an interesting one. Sadly, it was sparked by a couple of incidences with our employees, particularly around gender-based violence, where they were either victims or in some cases perpetrators, and we had to come up with a direction and a response and how we were going to handle this. So I have roped in my colleague Stephen. He is from our FirstRand Wellbeing team, and he's been quite instrumental and pivotal in driving this agenda and making sure that it lands with the relevant stakeholders. So he's going to take us through a couple of slides, just really indicating our journey to date, some important points that we need to consider when we're embarking on this this type of initiative, and then touch finally on our response to COVID, our flexible working arrangements that we've implemented, and the impact on mental health. So between Stephen and I, we'll kind of do a little dance, but he'll predominantly lead the conversation. So over to you, Stephen.
Perfect, thank you, Liesl, and good morning, everybody. So yes, like Liesl has said, my name is Stephen Routledge. I'm from the FirstRand Employee Wellbeing team, and yeah, one of our projects over the last couple of years has been to put together a response to the Gbvh pandemic and sort of everything that we are seeing around the world as well as in South Africa. So yeah, what we'll do is we'll just take you through our journey, like Liesl mentioned, and then just touch on a few important points and a few learnings that we have learned along the way, which you guys can hopefully make use of as you do sort of, investigate and explore opportunities within your areas. Okay, so I'm just going to share it there. Yeah, so just to give you guys an understanding of our journey and as well as to how we got here. So it was towards the end of 2018 and beginning of 2019, where we realized from our EAP data, from feedback from business, that there was quite a few Gbvh related issues within the business. So what we wanted to do there was just to put together a few resources available to employees to assist them should they ever be in need. So what we did there is we explored a lot of resources and information through various organizations, as well as the South African police force. We worked closely with our legal teams just to gather as much information and resources as possible to be able to assist employees who are either themselves victims of Gbvh, or if they know of someone and they would like to assist them. So those resources were quite varied and quite expensive. So what they consisted of was, in the event of if you are a victim of abuse, what to do from a process perspective, from going to the police station, to applying for protection order, going to a court, to if you have to apply for certain custody, any legal advice. So if you needed to get legal representation in court, what are the processes there? And then also one of the more trickier topics also was to assist victims of rape. So what we did there was, we gathered information from various medical professionals, as well as the South African police force. And what we did there was anyone who was a victim of rape would put together a process of what to do in the event that you are a victim of rape, or if you're assisting a victim. And that could be, from the steps that they would go to the hospital, to the police station, the do's and don'ts, just to ensure that if there is ever a criminal case, the relevant evidence and information is collected. And then as well as support afterwards. So, if you do needed to get any medical assistance, if you needed counseling, etc., we'll put together all those resources there. And then what we also put together was quite a comprehensive list of shelters and NGOs and safe houses across the country. So with the help of our employee assistance program, we gathered quite a large database there. And so if you were in any of the provinces in South Africa, you would have quick access to any of those shelters or safe houses via contact details. So you'll be able to source them there quite quickly. And what we did with all those resources, we put them on an intranet page. And from there, employees were able to then, get that information. And then what we did after that, so once we had all our resources available, we realized there was still quite a bit to do from the next step. So having your resources available is one thing, but employees and people sometimes need that extra little bit of assistance and support. So what we did there, we put together a task team with various stakeholders throughout business, within the FirstRand Group. So we have members from our security team, we have members from the human capital community, from employee well-being, we have our policy, our reward representatives there. And what we've done is we've done different work streams within the Gbvh process. So we took our resources and we said, okay, what are our next steps? So how can we assist from a medical scheme perspective? How can we assist from a security perspective if an employee phones you at 10 o'clock on a Friday night to say, you know, they are being harassed or they are being abused? What can you do as a HC or a wellbeing specialist? You know, how can you assist them? So through that, those various stakeholders, we've got a few different work streams, and we've identified certain areas that we work in much closer on there, where we're trying to assist employees from a support as well as a resource perspective there. So it's sort of just taking that next step beyond just providing them resources and putting actual processes and systems in place to assist them. And then what we've also done as a part of that, one of the stems from that task team, I know Paula and Diana will touch on it quite a lot later, is our Gbvh Ambassadors. So Paula and Diana trained a selected group of our employees to become Gbvh Ambassadors. So they did quite a brief and quite an intensive few days of training with them, where they took them through, you know, the legal aspects of Gbvh, you know, what is Gbvh, how can you assist employees, the do's and don'ts there. And then as well as not only are they trained to become ambassadors, you know, to learn more about it, know more about it, but now they're also able to assist them with our various processes and resources that we have in place. So instead of just having one selected team, you know, within business to support, now we have all these ambassadors across the group who are able to always support employees, pick up on any issues, and then we sort of have a nice back and forth relationship where we work closer with them now to do that. And then another important step in our work was working closer with our EAP, so to have them as our one point of contact for employees. So we had quite a few engagements with our EAP, where we, you know, went with their legal teams, their counseling teams, their call center support teams. And what we did there, we took them through all our processes, all our resources that we had in place. So they well versed and trained on what to do if an employee from FirstRand does call in with a Gbvh related issue. And then they are able to direct the employee to the different resources available, as well as you know, assist them with any counseling and support needed there. And then one of the biggest sort of achievements, I would say, or one of the most important things we had to do from our side was to get that board buy-in. So we were very fortunate enough to have our head of human capital as our executive sponsor. So that person did support the initiative and bought it in from the start. And they were able to go to the much larger boards and, you know, get that buy-in and approvals from a budgeting perspective, from a process perspective. So it just always helps, you know, to get that support from the top end and for it to stem down as we do go along. So one of the sort of trickiest issues we had was, you know, it's always good to have your processes and your program in place, but to land it in business is always a tricky sort of aspect. I'm sure a lot of you will know from various campaigns and initiatives. It's always good to have it, but does it always stem down and, you know, get marketed and employees become aware as you want it? So we put together quite a comprehensive communication plan. So through various mediums of communication, you know, we pushed out the message, you know, that there is these resources available, there is the intranet page available, the task team, the ambassadors. So yeah, we have quite a nice lineup of communications throughout the year, so a constant reminder. So not just during those 60 days of activism, we do it throughout the year to keep pushing the message there, which helps quite a bit. And then another important learning that we had when we landed in business was ensuring that it was aligned with existing policies. So where we have a sexual harassment policy, it would ensure that a lot of the processes and that we put in place were aligned to it, as well as vice versa. So if we needed to adapt any of our policies, we were able to do so to ensure that it's all in line and cohesive with both programs there. And then another important landing we had was presenting this offering at various levels. So not just, you know, presenting it at our main board with our executive sponsor and then sending out communications, but attending various town halls, various excos throughout business, various platforms. Wherever we had the opportunity, we would present that, you know, the Gbvh offering to show what support is available. And in doing so with that, you know, it's not only just getting the heads of certain segments aware, it's getting to all those various levels of employees, because not everyone's going to read that email that comes through or read that intranet banner. So, you know, getting to them on different levels helps quite a bit there. And another important, or the last important area there, is just that continued enhancement. So our Gbvh task team meets once a month for around 2 hours, and we check in on what we're doing, if what we're doing is still relevant. So ensuring that our policies are still in place, are still following everything from a legal perspective, and then where we need to, we can adapt and change as we do go along there. All right. And then just some points to consider. So for those who would like to, address anything from a Gbvh perspective, what you could do, some points to consider when you are planning that. Obviously, confidentiality and sensitivity, a very sensitive issue. A lot of employees are either, embarrassed or ashamed, or they don't want people to know, that they are a victim. So one thing you really need to consider there is your confidentiality. So, everything that you do, that you're putting in place, ensure that confidentiality is the number one point. Gain the trust of the employees, that they know that there is a safe place to go to, be it one shared mailbox, a reporting line, for example. So try not to assign it to a particular person. And then, just from that sensitivity part. So also consider those who are part of your task teams, who are gathering all those resources. It is quite a bit of information to take in, to absorb, and some of it can be quite graphic. It can be quite sort of traumatic for some people. So just consider the sensitivities around that. And then with regards to your resources, if you do a Google search of Gbvh assistance, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of pages, different organizations, different processes to follow. So most of them are good, most of them are reliable, but just ensure that you are consistent, that you are constantly checking that they are still relevant. So if you have certain contact details for a safe house, for example, always check up, make sure the contact details are the same, make sure the legal processes are still the same ones. Just ensure that you are following along the same things there, and make use of the various NGOs and government organizations and resources there. So a lot of them are very helpful, and they also stay on track of everything. And then another big issue there to consider is your budget. So we've learned quite quickly that it does cost quite a lot to offer this service. So, from your communication budget, to getting the message out there, to any, support that you want to offer employees, be it security assistance, be it, personal protection officers, putting them in a safe house, for example. So just ensure that you have all those costs covered for or budgeted for, just to ensure that you don't, fall short on anything when you do want to offer it to employees there. And then lastly, just that mental health aspect. So obviously, victims of Gbvh do go through quite a lot of trauma. It is quite a sort of traumatic experience for not only them, but also their family members and everyone else involved in the process. So just ensure that you do have that support available for them, be it through your EAP, through on-site counselors, and then not only for the victims, but also those who are, assisting with the project, taking employees through the process. Just ensure that you do have that support and counseling perspective, assisting them there. And then another big issue we've also realized is just acknowledging the safety, the risk, and the liability, and any liability issues associated with it. So, if you do have an employee who calls you at that 10 o'clock on a Friday night, and you have someone from your organization who will drive to the employee's house to try and assist them, just consider any safety and liability risk there, and try and just sort of alleviate them through various service providers where possible there. Right. And Lizo did mention that we did have quite a few responses to address mental health, especially in the time of COVID. So last year, I'm sure like many of you, towards the beginning of the year, you kicked into overdrive with everything COVID-19 responsive. So what we did is we're fortunate enough to work with a team of doctors who have assisted us with putting together quite a comprehensive process to follow, for any COVID-19 employees or employees who do test positive for COVID-19. And they've assisted us with putting together various resources available, which we have put on a portal for them. And then they also have quite a comprehensive process to assist employees who do test positive. So it's regular checkups with them, so they'll phone them throughout the day, ensuring that they are isolating as they need to, putting them in contact with different isolation facilities where if they were needed, and then also following up with them, so post-recovery, to ensure that they are still feeling healthy and then getting back into sort of normality there. And then from a well-being side, how we responded to the COVID-19. So obviously there's quite a large mental health impact with employees, now working from home, those who usually would go to work to socialize, now being alone at home. So we put together quite a few mental health resources on our intranet pages. So it offered various, amounts of support, how to, practice self-care in isolation, how to still, connect with people in a meaningful way while in isolation. And then we also put together quite a few lockdown initiatives. So from having healthy cook-alongs with celebrity chefs, where we had daily mindfulness sessions with our employees, just to take their mind off of things and pause for a minute just to focus on themselves. And then we also put together quite a few working from home initiatives. So, for example, ergonomics, how to set up your workstation correctly at home, how to do exercises at your desk or at home without any equipment, how to turn cleaning into fun forms of exercise, exercising with the kids. So yeah, we try to just address everything there from a mental health side, while still ensuring that employees were physically and mentally active, and then as well as still benefiting from all the resources that we had there. Right. And then I'll just hand over back to Liesl just to discuss the meeting boundaries and what changes we have done along there.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, with regards to meeting boundaries, it was lovely to see the organisation and leadership take the lead with regards to that. We were noticing our employees were working extended hours. From data determining our productivity levels were actually significantly increased through the working from home sort of arrangements. And we realized quite quickly that we needed to put plans in place to actually slow our employees down and give them the authority and the mandate to stop working. And so many of our business areas and business units determined specific days and hours where they were meeting free times. So firstly, the initial comms was no meetings were allowed to be held before 8 in the morning and after 5 in the evening. So, just allowing a little bit of family time. And that proved to be insufficient because, 8 to 5 is still a full day of meetings. And when does one get the time to actually do the work that comes out of those meetings? Ordinarily we'd have a 5-minute chat on the way to coffee and discuss a point, and then you can go and do some work. Whereas now people were setting up half an hour or 1 hour meetings to discuss that same topic as such. So many of our businesses also then said, so for example, in our retail segment, which is the biggest, they decided on a Wednesday up until 12 in the morning, no meetings are allowed to be held. And on a Friday afternoon from 3 onwards, no meetings are allowed to be held. So really just putting some almost forced boundaries in place to allow people time to catch up on work, regroup, whatever's necessary, do some work reading or whatever the case might be. So I think it's been well received within the business, and something we constantly consider and address. We are driving a lot of sort of conscientiousness around what time leaders send out emails and what perception are we creating in our more junior sort of employee workforce, in terms of, if my leader's sending me a mail at 8 o'clock at night, should I be responding at that time? And really creating very strong boundaries in terms of, no, you have your working hours and you have an output that needs to be delivered. It doesn't have to be coinciding with your leader's working hours, etc. So a lot of learnings, and I think we're well on our way. We probably still have a lot more to do, and we're learning every day. But I think that as a response, the FirstRand Group has definitely stepped up and done as much as they can as we learn on this journey. And then I think in closing, I'd just like to also just thank Paula and Diana. They were also instrumental, as Stephen mentioned. They did run our ambassador learning program for us, and the content was really well received. And they raised some really pertinent points that we as an organization hadn't necessarily considered. And I think it allowed us to build on what we had already done. So thank you especially to them. They are your next speakers. So I'm looking forward to the remainder of the morning. And thank you, Cole, for the opportunity. And thank you, Stephen. Job well done. Thank you. Handing back to you, Cole.
Thanks, Liesl and Stephen. And I just don't know, Stephen, I know you've got to run. What time do you have to run?
Mute.
You're on mute, Stephen.
You're off at 10 o'clock. So
at 10
I
o'clock.
can hang around and answer questions.
So before you leave, if there are any questions, can we take just a few before you leave? If there are any questions for that. Any questions for Stephen and Liesl before I hand over to Paula and Diana? Nothing?
No.
Well, I tell you stumped them both.
They're welcome to reach out at any time directly with either one of us, should they want to.
Fantastic, super, thank you. And Stephen, thanks so much for making time to be with us this morning. So Paula, Diana, I'm going to hand over to you guys. Who's going to go first? Paula, you're going to go.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Thanks for inviting us to share our experience and insights. And just to Stephen and Liesl, again, just kudos to FirstRand Group being one of the most proactive corporates that we've worked with, that have been really proactive in taking care of their employees and addressing a topic such as GBVH. Really well done to you guys as well. So we're going to touch a bit, well, a bit of both on mental health and wellness and the GBVH stuff. So just a little bit of background about myself before Diana introduces herself. We've been working together, closely together for, I think, almost 2 years now, if I remember correctly. And my area of expertise and background is really in the people space, in terms of personal development, soft skills, and mental health and wellness, which links very closely to that. And then GBV came along. It's actually been one of my passion areas, and I'm a passionate advocate for it, first of all as a GBVH survivor myself, but also that I work closely with some of the support organizations out there like Lifeline as a volunteer counsellor. And so I'd also do individual work as well as work within corporates. Diana, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having us. Again, I just wanted to say thank you to Liesl and Stephen. F&B's done a fantastic job, especially in relation to mental health, wellness and GBVH. So we were very happy to work with them. And I am Diana Schwartz. I am the director and founder of Diana Schwartz Attorneys. We are a niche, small boutique firm, and we focus on certain areas of law. Amongst that, I'm known as a social media law expert. I'm a child's rights activist and a GBVH activist as well. We work with various organizations, corporates providing trainings on different areas. And we also have as one of our partners, Hope Risen Foundation, which is a anti-human trafficking organization. So thank you very much for having us.
So in terms of mental health and well-being, I mean, it's become very topical lately due to COVID and the pandemic. But generally what a lot of people, or the majority of people, are actually referring to, or what they're keeping in mind when talking about mental health, is they're really actually talking about self-care routines, particularly when it comes to digital fatigue and being online all the time, and being able to, or having the ability to be able to implement boundaries, particularly when it comes to personal life and work life, and those boundaries being very blurred at the moment. And why that's impacted us, or why mental health has become so topical, is because COVID's brought about so much unexpected change, resulting in abnormal stresses. When it comes to change, we normally have a choice. We buy into change. It's something that we've thought about, we've processed, and we've bought into it, and we have a willingness to change. So I'm going to use the example of, let's say you want to lose weight. It's something that, you know, you've bought into, and you're going to eat healthy, and you're going to exercise, and all those kind of things. So we've bought into the change process, but with COVID, we didn't have that choice. That choice was taken away from us. One day, life was as normal, and the very next day, overnight, we were in extreme lockdown. Everything was taken away from us, and all of our choices were taken away from us. We had no time to prepare for it, and which is what resulted in the panic buying behavior that we saw. Some people just panic going into that fight, flee, freeze mode, and we really were sort of overwhelmed and at a loss as to what was going on around us. At the same time, there was a time frame that we had all kind of got our heads around, which was we were going into lockdown for 21 odd days, and so we knew there was an end in sight. But as we got closer and closer to that deadline, lockdown was extended and then extended, and now 18 months later, we're still in forms of lockdown, and our restrictions get adjusted. So in the beginning, we were all rah-rah, baking banana bread, having online house parties and social drinks and sundowners and all those kind of things, until the novelty started wearing off. And we started realizing that this was affecting us on so many levels, individually as well as from an organizational perspective. And what we haven't really, or what is not really being spoken about when it comes to mental health and wellness, is that according to the Mental Health Federation of South Africa, over 17 million South Africans are dealing with depression, substance abuse, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, which make up the top 5 mental illnesses or diagnoses that people are dealing with, and from a mental health sector perspective. And so we've had to learn to adjust our environment. We've had to learn to adjust our ways of doing things. So, for example, from a work point of view, our job title might be the same, our job role and function might be the same, but the way we do it and where we do it from has changed. And with that has come additional stresses, working from home, trying to juggle home life balances. There's distractions at home, especially when we were homeschooling, and some kids are still being homeschooled. Social isolation, lack of access to information and resources, and lack of face-to-face interaction and human connection. And so this is really what has been putting mental health under the spotlight right now, because people are not coping in the way that they had previously, and because of all these abnormal stresses that we've had to deal with. And so just a little overview on what's happening in the mental health space at the moment. But Diana, from your perspective, are there any legal obligations when it comes to employers and organizations in respect of employees' mental health and wellness?
Short answer is yes, definitely. I also come from a labour law background. I've been practicing labour law for the last 15 years. And what's really important when it comes to COVID is Section 8 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So that's coming to bear under mental health and wellness, and the duty of the employer or the organisation to keep to maintain a healthy and safe work environment for their employees. Now, this becomes quite tricky because now the home has become the workplace. And how does an employer or an organisation go about maintaining that safe and healthy work environment? And under that banner, also we find Gbvh as falling as one of the duties. So previously, OSHA, as they call it, or OSA, used to just govern, workplaces with plant machinery and equipment. That is now extended into mental health and physical health. So it's both mental health and physical health. And in respect of Gbvh, it's quite interesting because we actually have a number of pieces of legislation that apply to that space, which most, organizations or even the layperson is just unaware of. There's about 11 pieces of legislation that actually apply to the Gbvh space, and also then link onto OSHA and keeping employers keeping a safe and healthy work environment for their employees.
And just for those that may not know what OSHA stands for.
So OSHA is the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and with that act, the Labour Law Act ties into that, and we have various other pieces of legislation that flow into the Gbvh space. So I think what's quite new is that people have never considered Gbvh as falling under mental health and wellness. However, it does, because that affects the productivity of employees. If they are now, for example, at home in an environment where there is some form of gender-based violence or harassment, it will directly affect their productivity. And as a result of COVID, and the home has now become the workplace. So employers and organizations need to, include that in their spectrum of thought under mental health.
Thanks, Diana. And just, to touch on what we're not seeing when it comes to mental health is some of the real loss and trauma on many levels, things that we wouldn't necessarily think of. So, for example, loss of identity. a lot of people are feeling lost within themselves, within their environment. Simple things like getting up and going to the office every day gave a person a sense of purpose and a sense of identity. They had somewhere to go and they had a role to fulfill and a place to be. And with that being taken away from us, a lot of people have struggled to kind of settle in and find a place or a space where they feel like they belong, especially being physically removed or distanced from the workplace and being online. Some of the concerns that are coming out now as well is around the loss or the risk of the loss of corporate culture, the risk of the loss of engagement in teams, communication channels, senses of trust, and also that place of keeping that culture and that rapport alive. Also, we've lost real losses due to COVID. We've all experienced personal losses or known of people that have experienced personal losses where COVID is concerned, and the very real fear and trauma that comes with that. We've also lost social supports systems with having to be physically, keep to physical distancing. Things like our families, our friends, elderly people or parents that we want to keep safe and protect. We've also lost our support systems in terms of activities or groups that we belong to, where we used to go out, and that gave us a sense of support and structure, and also an outlet as well to help us deal with and cope with life's stresses. Things like exercise, gyms, book clubs, social clubs, other forums, etc. And so another real concern that's coming out with mental health is burnout. And a lot of companies that I've been dealing with, this is one of their top priorities, is that a lot of people are working longer hours than before. And this is because one of the things we've lost is that definite start and end to our working day, which was signaled by our commute to and from the workplace. Mm-hmm. And now that we're not commuting to and from the workplace, a lot of us have lost that definite start and end, and so our hours are blurring because we're either getting online earlier and starting to work earlier because it's easier to walk from the lounge or the bedroom or the kitchen to wherever your workplace is. But also at the end of the day, the creep comes in where, we're finishing later, so 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. I know some people that have been working until 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning in some industries. And so this burnout is really coming about due to the long hours that we're working, back-to-back meetings with no breaks in between, and unrealistic expectations in some environments of the always needing to be on or online or available, employees not feeling valued, potentially toxic workplace cultures, a sense of lack of support from peers or managers or leaders and or the organization as a whole. There's also job insecurity in terms of where some people have either had to take salary cuts or they've lost their jobs, or even businesses have had to close down due to the impact of COVID. And then lone working, working on your own alone. So particularly people that don't have a family or relationships or families that they're with, so they live on their own. That is in itself is an issue where chronic loneliness is also coming to light, but also lone working. Not feeling a part of the team, not having regular contact with your team. So loneliness in the workplace can trigger employees, resulting in emotional withdrawal. And there's lots of studies that have been done. And in fact, these studies were done long before COVID came about. There were studies done in the UK, in the US, and also in Australia around chronic loneliness. And it's actually called the looming loneliness epidemic, where they've done research that the impact of chronic loneliness on our immune system and our mental health is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which makes it much more deadlier than obesity. And other things that are not being spoken about that are coming to light is male loneliness. Men, and this is where the gender stereotyping comes in, men have been conditioned from a young age to be tough, to not show emotion because it's seen as a weakness. So men in particular don't really reach out for help or ask for help because of how they've been raised, the perceptions from a society, a culture perspective that they need to be self-sufficient, they need to be the providers and the caretakers and the protectors. And so the shame and the stigma that goes with that, and what we're seeing in terms of the suicide rates from the World Health Organization, is that South African men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women. Another trend that we're starting to see, and I know, Cole, you and I have spoken about this as well, is that the latest stats is 1 in 4 women are considering leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers because of the juggling that they're having to do with the amount of time spent on household responsibilities. So things like shopping, cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, homeschooling, etc., and or looking after elderly parents, and then trying to manage and juggle work life as well and deliver on their work deliverables and responsibilities. And then what we've been touching on is obviously gender-based violence and harassment, and what some organizations like FirstRand Group have just shared with us, starting to realize that employees or some employees are not safe working at home, and how do we now start providing for this? Because you know, as part of our whether we call it our duty, our responsibility, or because we really want to show that we care about employees, how do we start providing for gender-based violence and harassment under our employee wellness service offerings, but also from a legislation and a compliance point of view? So Diana, are there any cases that you're aware of where duties of employers or organizations have been taken to court or handled in court?
Yes, so there's quite an important case that was decided in 2018. It is the title of the case is Janssen versus Legal Aid, and it was decided in our labour courts. And basically, what this case highlighted and resulted in is that the courts noted that employers, or not noted, they ruled that employers and organizations cannot ignore mental health issues, and that they need specifically to have mental health policies and health policies in place to accommodate employees who may be suffering from any mental illness or mental health issues, and any related consequences from the COVID pandemic. And there again, we have that GBVH that falls under the banner of you know, our employees facing these circumstances in the home environment. And it also set out the very adverse consequences for employers or organizations who don't actually have the proper policies in place and who don't actually consider mental health and wellness. So that was quite a landmark judgment and very effective in South Africa. I think what I'd like to ask you, Paula, is you've talked a lot about, you know, the things that we don't see as part of mental health. What about GBVH? What are some of the myths that you have seen, and why should we include it under this banner of mental health and wellness?
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I think, you know, using the terminology gender-based violence and harassment, when we hear that term, we default to thinking of or associating it with male on female abuse and physical and or sexual violence. We don't think about the other forms of abuse and the others and across the range of spectrums involved. So what I mean is, we don't think about female on male abuse, because it does happen, and I have dealt with male survivors. We don't think about the LGBTQI community and the forms of abuse that happen in that community. We don't think about child abuse, and we also don't think about human trafficking and harassment in the workplace. And so it's kind of, there's the association that gender-based violence, and I think it limits our, and I'm saying this respectfully, it limits our thinking to only thinking of one aspect of abuse. But what we're seeing from the stats is that South Africa is reported as the highest rape statistics in the world. And the last count was 500,000 rape cases per annum, which works out to 1,370 rapes per day in our country.
Wow.
Share the link with you where that's concerned.
And then Paula, also just in relation, it's quite interesting that you're sharing the stats. What does it actually cost corporates? Does GBVH affect their budgets? Does it actually, make an impact on that, basically the income, the industry? How does it impact that? Are there stats in relation to that?
There have been some stats done. There hasn't been an updated report as of the last 18 months that I've seen, but the one that was done by KPMG says that gender-based violence and harassment costs the corporate sector between 28 and 42 billion rand per annum. And so this is a large sum of money, but I think more importantly, not just GBV on its own, but if we take the cost of gender-based violence plus mental health and we put those two amounts together, it is a significant cost, not only to us as a country, but also to corporates when they're looking at those costs and how they are providing, or what support services they are able to provide or willing to provide to their employees. And then obviously that's excluding, I guess, from a medical health perspective in terms of, your own medical aid contributions, if you are one of the fortunate to be on medical aid, but just in terms of the costs to the support services like policing, safety, security, NPOs, NGOs, hospitals, etc. So Diana, in terms of just talking about GBV, I mean, I've touched on the typical, or what we know as the common forms of GBVH. With the other forms of abuse that aren't necessarily spoken about underneath that banner is obviously the mental, verbal, emotional abuse, and then also financial abuse. But you deal a lot with online forms of gender-based violence and harassment. And we're living in an online world now, and you've seen the stats increase on that in that area. What is that all about?
Yes, so from an online perspective, we have a lot of issues of gender-based violence and harassment occurring online across social media platforms, across emails, WhatsApp groups. We all communicate through some or other form of social media or online device, if I can put it that way. And what we see very often is the online forms of GBVH. And when I speak about online forms of GBVH, there are various different forms. So we've got cyberbullying, we have cyber stalking, we have revenge pornography, we have child pornography, human trafficking, we have online grooming, and the list can go on and on. And what we're seeing is that I think there needs to be a bigger awareness on what online forms of GBVH are and how do we include that as organizations and employers in our policies, because to simply cover the word online forms of gender-based violence and harassment, what does that actually mean? And I'll give you an example. So say that an employer has a policy that does address it, but just, has a blanket approach and says online forms of harassment. And somebody, the approved form of communication for the business or organization is emails, for example, or Teams like we're using today. And one employee sends another employee an inappropriate meme or video or picture on WhatsApp. What are the duties and obligations then that come into play from the organization's perspective in protecting their employees? And also, what does our policy say about that? So I think there needs to be a broader view around that. Some of the stats in relation to what's happening online. Cyberbullying, currently South Africa is number 4 in the world for cyberbullying. So we are not far off. It's not only happening in the USA or the UK, it's happening right here. And this is not only amongst children and teens, it's amongst workplaces, it's amongst colleagues, it's happening in the workplace, not only physically, but online as well. And then in terms of cyber stalking, the stats actually show that actual physical stalking of predators of their victims is lower than the cyber stalking that happens. And unfortunately, as wonderful as the internet is, it does make it easier for cyber criminals and predators to gain access to their victims. So those are some of the things that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of revenge pornography happening, where there's a relationship that ends badly, and a partner will then post, sexual pictures that were exchanged during the relationship, or videos. A lot in our celebrity and media sort of sector, we see that happening a lot. We see a lot of naming and shaming of alleged sexual perpetrators that happens online, which is actually unlawful if a legal process hasn't been followed. So these are just some of the aspects. There are quite a few to delve into.
And are you finding that a lot of corporates' policies and protocols are not being updated to comply with the changes in legislation? Because there have been some changes in legislation recently.
Yes, I think so. I think especially in terms of online social media liability, what are employees allowed to do and not allowed to do, and what will the employer do to protect those employees, and how do they deal with these situations? And also from a labor perspective, we see many employees being dismissed for their posts in their personal capacities. Everybody has a disclaimer up that says, these are my own views and opinions, and it's not associated to any organization or affiliated that I'm affiliated with or work with, but unfortunately that's not how it works. Employees are being dismissed for bringing their employers into disrepute all the time for social media, misconduct, as we can call it. And what we see as well from a GBVH perspective is that, gender-based violence is largely geared towards sexual harassment, if I can put it that way. And it doesn't include, the physical, the financial, all of the things that you've mentioned. But also what's quite important is that we need to realize that sexual harassment is varied. So I mentioned earlier that there are quite a few pieces of legislation covering GBVH, and one of those pieces is the Sexual Offences and Related Amendment Act. So employers or organizations may not look at it and think, well, this is just for rape, or this is just for sexual assault. But for example, sexual harassment has many different forms. So you could have a sexual innuendo that is actually part of the definition of sexual harassment. So it's just things like that we are seeing, that employers and organizations really need to tighten up their policies, review them, adapt them with current laws and amendments. And there are new laws being developed all the time. So for example, we now also have the Cyber Crimes and Cybersecurity Bill, which speaks directly to revenge pornography, which is just now in 2020 been finalized. So we have to revise our policies and make sure that they're up to date with current laws and amended laws as well.
And one of the things that people don't necessarily think of, and I'm talking individuals and or organizations, you mentioned earlier revenge porn, but closely followed on that, and we've seen a couple of cases with the naming, shaming, blaming from a social media point of view.
Yes.
And Stephen actually spoke to it or referred to it earlier around the confidentiality when it comes to a victim, but also a perpetrator. And I'm going to touch a little bit more on victims and perpetrators just now, but just in terms of the legal rights and obligations from a victim and a perpetrator, where the naming, shaming, blaming is concerned. Maybe you just want to expand on that a bit.
Yes, so this is quite a controversial issue, and especially in South Africa, when we saw the huge outcry that we've had with regards to gender-based violence and femicide in the last couple of years, and our president has actually reviewed certain pieces of legislation, or currently being reviewed, to tighten them up, like the domestic violence bill, etc. So revenge pornography is really something that's happening a lot. And with naming and shaming, we have victims, and largely women, with respect, who are finding solidarity in groups like the Me Too movement, and going onto social media platforms and then naming and shaming alleged perpetrators. But what they don't realize is that that is actually unlawful, because in South Africa, the identity of both perpetrators and victims are protected by the Criminal Procedure Act. So an alleged victim cannot actually name and shame an alleged perpetrator until that perpetrator has actually pleaded in court. And this not only goes for the victim, it goes for the press as well. And this is not only to protect identities in sexual offence matters, it's also to make sure that that justice is carried out and, you know, in accordance with court systems. You know, previously in our law, we would have sexual offence or sexual assault cases. They would call it in camera, meaning privately. The press were not allowed to cover such cases. So there are certain rules that, you know, the courts have in place. There can be obstructions of justice. There's trial by social media, where an alleged perpetrator would be tried by the public at large and determined guilty without even setting foot in a court of law. And what's important for the perpetrators, and as I said, I am a Gbvh advocate and a women's rights advocate as well, is that the victim will often experience secondary traumatization and then open themselves up to legal liability. So the alleged perpetrator who's been named and shamed with address, name, details, or just the name or identity that can be recognized, can sue an alleged victim for defamation of character because it has not been proved yet, and also for something called crimen injuria. So now crimen injuria is quite a funny word to pronounce. It is a criminal offence in our law, and our landmark case in this instance was Vicky Momberg. You know, she was recorded uttering hate speech, and then she was convicted of crimen injuria and was imprisoned for that. So crimen injuria is the unlawful intentional impairment of a person's dignity, and that directly links to GBVH. So if you go and name and shame someone and you haven't followed proper legal process, or it hasn't been proven in a court of law, this is what you can actually open yourself up to. And so there needs to be a lot of awareness around that, because the last thing we would want is to have a victim of a GBVH offence exposed to secondary traumatization and then legal action against them. So it is quite tricky, but it's something that happens quite a lot.
I see you've got a hand up, Cole.
Yeah, Paula, I was just wanting to see if you had picked up that question in the chat box.
No, sorry, I will look at it now. I can't see it on my side. Cole, can you just share it for us?
Yeah, it says, are there any new developments in law regarding parental alienation related to GBVH, e.g. parents using kids as weapons to hurt each other?
Yes, there are. This happens also, unfortunately, very often. That is being recognized, and children's rights are being recognized much more than they have in the past. There is case law to prevent parents from doing so. You cannot use your child as a tool. You cannot even speak for your child in certain instances. So what we're also seeing, which is quite interesting, is that it hasn't happened yet in South Africa, but there are a few cases that we will be seeing quite soon, where children are actually suing their parents for basically documenting their lives online from the moment they are born until, you know, adulthood, and without their consent. So children's voices are being heard more. Children, I think what we have to look at is that we are legal guardians. I'm a mother myself. We are legal guardians and we are parents, but we do not own our children, and they have their own constitutional rights. So yes, definitely, I can share those details with you if you like after the session. But yes, children cannot be used in this way, and our courts are taking recognition of that. And our Children's Act say, and our Constitution says that the rights, the best interests of the child are of paramount importance in any matter concerning a child. So that's where that falls under as well.
So I see another question is, how do we connect GBVH ambassadors in our organization or department? We will touch on that. Okay, thank you. So yeah, just thanks for clarifying that, Diana, because I think often we don't, when we talk GBVH, we don't think about the child abuse that falls under that banner. And I think that is the busting the myth of GBVH, because there's so much more that falls underneath that banner that we don't think or associate with that term. And I think back to, you mentioned the word of re-traumatizing or secondary trauma. And this is one of the main reasons why it's so important to include GBVH under mental health and well-being. So first of all, from an employee point of view, if you are experiencing any form of trauma personally in your personal space, you cannot be mentally well. And or in the workplace for that matter. And that trauma can play out in various different ways. Everybody copes with and deals with and processes trauma differently. It can come out as stress, anxiety, depression, emotional and social withdrawing, which ultimately affects our productivity, our ability to be creative, a team player, the ability to collaborate, critical problem solving, thinking, and also engagement. And so, in order to have good, healthy relationships in the workplace, we need to understand that the workplace is now the home. And if we don't have good, healthy relationships in the home environment, we cannot function at a level where we are able to operate at our optimum and be able to cope with everyday normal stresses, let alone the additional stresses of what we are potentially experiencing, because we're experiencing some form of abuse. And the reason why the stats are what they are, which in fact isn't even the full stats, because those are only the cases that are reported. There are many cases that go unreported because of the shame and the stigma that's associated with it, the embarrassment. A lot of people stay in traumatic situations for various reasons. I'm talking particularly around victims here. The fear of the repercussions if they try to leave. A lot of the time they have tried to leave before and there's been serious repercussions, which is why they stay. The fear of being on their own and being alone. The fear of not being able to provide for themselves and or their children from a financial perspective. The fear of being rejected by family and friends and communities and societies at large. So there's very many reasons why victims choose to stay in a toxic environment or an abusive environment. But what we're not able to track under the GBVH banner is the other forms of abuse, the mental, emotional, verbal, and financial abuse. And those forms of abuse will play out more around the stress, depression, anxiety, etc. Because there's no, and I say this respectfully, there's no physical evidence of abuse that takes place here. So it's very hard to detect. But the ways that we start seeing it is observing the behavior, the human behavior, that changes over time as a person starts experiencing this and gets to their tipping point where they can no longer cope or they're just starting to unravel, so to speak. And then again, we generally associate this with women. We don't look at men, and we don't associate that men can be victims of abuse as well. Not only sexual abuse, but also physical abuse and mental and emotional abuse. And we're not talking about men's health when it comes to GBVH and mental health and well-being, but the stats are showing us that it is equally important. And especially if we are talking diversity, equality, and inclusion in the workplace, and this is a whole nother topic. But men's and women's needs are, from a mental health and well-being perspective, should be equally important and have equal support in the workplace.
I think that's great, Paula. I think I like that you've touched on that because, you know, when it comes to, we've had many conversations about how do we actually tackle this huge pandemic of its own, GBVH, and we've said, you know, how do you need to get to the root cause of an issue in order to eradicate it, and that's what we eventually want, and that's a mammoth task. But how do we look at it? And we've also said that we have to look at perpetrators and what causes that behavior to start with, and we know that that starts in the home. And I think it's quite important as well around training. For example, we have many men in the workplace, and apologies that I'm using men, but we have people in the workplace, not only men, who do not actually know what is appropriate and not appropriate in terms of sexual harassment again. A sexual innuendo, a suggestive comment. Often when we train, we see that, you know, for example, a man or a partner or a person or a woman or whatever it is may give a compliment and think that I'm giving a compliment commenting on a person's appearance, and that is not sexual harassment. However, it can be sexual harassment if it meets certain requirements in terms of the definitions. So it's so important to not only just focus on the victims, but also the perpetrators and what causes the behavior in order to eradicate it.
So then I see there's a question for you in the chat group. What are the responsibilities of the organization when it comes to reporting GBVH? For example, if an employee reports to their manager or HR that they are suffering abuse at home, what is the legal obligation from an organization in terms of reporting, having confidentiality in mind, but also the health and safety of the employee? Should this be reported to the authorities, or what's the process?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think that obviously, I think the first thing to say is when a crime has been committed in accordance with our law, if somebody has been raped, if a child has been abused, there is a legal duty on the employer to actually report that. So that's in any context. But obviously, when it comes to confidentiality, you know, it's extremely important. We also now have privacy legislation, POPI, the Protection of Personal Information Act, that has to be considered when we're dealing with people's personal information. And part of that would be health records. It would be information regarding a person's home life and their personal life. So it's a very tricky place to be in. And that's why it's so important to have the policies and procedures and training in place to know how to deal with it. But there does exist a legal duty on an employer to report a crime that they are aware of. So what we would advise, and I think, Paula, you know, we've had this question in our trainings before, we would say, obviously, we keep confidential as far as possible. We give the victim the options. For example, as a Gbvh ambassador, you would give the victim all their options in terms of what they can do and what they can't do. These are the resources the organization is offering, and it's up to them as to what they actually want to do. We cannot make the decision for them. However, when a crime has been committed, and especially, for example, where the employer organization feels like perhaps this is an incident where a person is being abused over a long period of time physically, you know, and the nature of the situation is very dire and very serious, and the employer may think that there is risk to the life of the individual, they would then need to report that. Yes.
And also where you have a duty and an obligation to report is where a child is concerned, right? Correct,
yes, very important. If you suspect, for example, just a very normal example, if you're a neighbor and you suspect that your neighbor, there is child abuse happening in your neighbor's home, you actually have a duty to report that to the authorities. The stats for GBVH amongst children and women in South Africa are extremely high, and children are often abused by someone in the home. So it's really important that we take that seriously. The domestic violence bill that is now being reviewed will have a legal duty and an offence and penalty for failing to report child abuse.
I see Tembi's asked a question. What are some of the stereotypes and challenges we should be mindful of with having males as GBVH ambassadors in our organization? You know, we've spoken about this ourselves in terms of those exact things, those gender stereotyping. So first of all, from a GBVH eradicating the issue perspective, it is equally a men's and a woman's, and I'm using those genders loosely, but it's both our problems. It's not just the woman's problem or just a male's problem. It's all of that, and I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in depth just now. But you may find that where men are victims themselves, they may feel more safer, easier talking to another male about it, or they may find it easier to open up and talk to a female about it. I think it's, and this is what we were very clear on with the ambassador training that we do, is that it's first of all treating someone as a human being, and then second of all, it's about creating a safe space and without judgment. And we're very clear on that, and creating a safe space, because it's taken a lot of courage for this person to reach out for help. So it's very, very important that if you are going to train up ambassadors within your organization, the foundation that you put down and how you train up these people to handle situations, because they could be faced with a situation where a victim reaches out for help or a perpetrator reaches out for help. So it's really important around laying the right foundation. And then second of all, it's very important how the organization communicates the role of these ambassadors within the organization, and how you portray that in a positive light, and that it's not about the gender of the ambassador, it's about the ambassador and what that ambassador can do for you, how that ambassador can help you. And I think that kind of touches into you know, talking about what approach should we be taking when it comes to mental health and GBVH. So first of all, if you are offering or providing any employee wellness or well-being services, what are you including under that banner? What types of services, what type of support? And when we're talking mental health and well-being, are you including GBVH? So that's the first step. Second step would be, how in depth do you want to go as an organization? There's been extremes here. There's been, and again, FirstRand Group being so proactive, and the steps that you've put in place, have wanted to take that step because they want to be seen as an employer of choice. They want to show that they care about the employees, and they've taken an invested interest by investing in the programs and the services that they've put in place. There's been other employers who have almost taken the opposite, where they go, you know what, we don't want to open that Pandora's box. We will deal with a case as it comes about ad hoc, and we'll deal with it in that instance. So it really depends. It's up to you, and as an organization, what stance do you want to take? What is your view on this, and how are you entrenching that within your organization from a corporate culture point of view, from a policies protocol point of view, from an employee wellness, well-being and services and support perspective? From our point of view, we believe that there should be a three-pronged approach. One, from a community point of view, and community in the broader sense of, it starts in our homes. First of all, as our own community, about how are we raising our boy and our girl children? How are we talking about GBVH and raising their level of awareness, and starting to change the narrative with future generations as to what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, and how can we start shifting that by changing their perspective and changing their behavior from a very early age. Then it's within our communities, our neighbors, the communities that we live in, our churches, our NPOs, our friendship circles. Are we having these kind of conversations in our friendship circles, within our own people and support structures? And GBVH should become a everyday topic. So just like we talk about, have you sanitized? Are you wearing your mask? Are you social distancing? We should be able to talk about GBVH in the same vein as an everyday conversation. The fact that we don't talk about it makes it a taboo subject. It makes it awkward and uncomfortable for people to talk about it. So we don't talk about it, which reinforces the shame and the stigma attached to it. So we need to start having conversations around this by making it a normal conversation to have, because that then creates a space for people to go, I'm not okay, I need help, I'm experiencing some kind of trauma or abuse or something. And then from a business point of view, we need to be having these conversations in businesses, because whether we like it or not, abuse happens in our homes, it happens in our communities, it happens in our businesses, and it happens in our country. And the campaigns that are out there primarily talk to victims. Nobody is talking to perpetrators. And if we didn't have perpetrators, we wouldn't be having victims, right? So we need to address it from both perspectives. And I say this respectfully, when it comes to perpetrators, we can no longer just slap people on the wrist and say, you need to go off to anger management classes, because that is not solving the problem. We are not born abusers. Abuse is a learned behavior. And just as you can unlearn and stop smoking, for example, you can unlearn how to be abusive, but you have to go for the right therapy or treatment or rehabilitation based on the source of that learned behavior. So we don't wake up and say, today I'm going to be an abuser. We've learned that over a period of time based on what we've been exposed to either in our childhood, within our community, within our social circles, and it gets reinforced by not talking about it, but also not calling people out on this behavior. So from a business point of view, we need to talk about it within our businesses, because it happens. We have employees who are victims, and we have employees who are perpetrators too. We just don't know about it because we're not talking about it, and we don't see enough examples of perpetrators that have put their hand up to say, I was abusive, I have rehabilitated, and this is how I've turned my life around, or turned the situation around, or stopped the behavior that I was doing. And then from a national government perspective, and that's a whole nother discussion and a long battle, but the support services in place in terms of policing forums, security, safety, service providers, NPOs, safe houses, all of those people, to have the right sort of support, education, awareness, training, budget, etc. behind it, so that collectively we can start changing the narrative and the landscape around gender-based violence at its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
That was a mouthful. Diana, in terms of, a question that often comes up for us is, what are the consequences of non-compliance for employers or businesses where GBVH is concerned?
Yes, okay, so it's a very good question. I'm going to answer you now. I just wanted to add to what you said just now. I think from the gender roles perspective, we have to be very careful, because also we have a big LGBTQI community and who don't identify as one or the other gender. So, having this community, they, don't identify as a particular, gender. So, and I also think having male ambassadors really is a great thing to have, including men in the conversation, because men have always been seen as the perpetrators and not part of the solution. So I think that really, really helps, just my little 2 cents there. And also just to bear in mind that a lot of organizations are developing remote working policies, even post-COVID. I know organizations who've adapted remote working policies, and they've adapted it for the future. It's not only going to happen post-COVID, whenever COVID is going to die down, because we don't know what the future holds. Some people speak of other, pandemics arising. Please God that we don't have any more pandemics. But, most employers and organizations are beefing up their work from home policies. And I think they need to also just bear in mind that perspective, that GBVH is always going to be an issue when it comes to that, and mental health and wellness. So there are quite hefty consequences for non-compliance. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 11 pieces of legislation that apply to this. And I talked a lot about the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And just in terms of that act, organizations can be fined quite heavily, from 100,000 Rand or 2 years jail or imprisonment for non-compliance of maintaining a safe and healthy work environment for employees. And what's quite important, and what a lot of organizations don't realize, is that the Criminal Procedure Act ties in and states that the company, not only the company, but the directors, the CEOs, the CFOs, can all be jointly and individually prosecuted with the company for non-compliance of statutory laws. So it's quite important when you look at it from that perspective. Also, if there are negligence claims, if we ignore the issues, also in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, if injury is caused by non-compliance, or even the fact, that employers are, from a physical perspective, the employer will be held liable. So also from a mental health perspective, the employer can and will be held liable. So we really need to realize then there's vicarious liability of employers and organizations for the conduct of their employees, not only to fellow employees, but people who enter their premises, like customers, etc. And, there's unfair labor practices that can arise. And there are so many consequences that we really can't afford to ignore it. We've talked about the case law earlier. We've talked about the policies in a lot of detail. And I think the ask is, when I look at the legal space and I talk to legal counsel, they say, why should I care, Diana? Why should I spend my budget on this work right now when there's so many other things that are vying for our attention? And as you've mentioned the stats, it is actually costing us money, and the productivity of our employees are being affected, and that costs us money. So I would rather say include it in your budget now, and also not only for the fact that it's costing us money, but for the fact that we can be imposed with hefty fines and have, these prison sentences, having our CEOs or our directors being prosecuted for not complying. So I know that sounds quite harsh, but that is the reality of what we're looking at.
Yeah. I see there's a question. Is there a lack of skills training for men surrounding the topic of sexual harassment and what is acceptable within the workplace, and dealing with mental health issues such as depression and suicide, as well as providing necessary tools to deal with aggression? Absolutely, I do. I think so, GBVH as a whole, but then underneath that, from a men's health perspective, we don't talk about these topics which makes it awkward and uncomfortable. So people don't want to talk about it, the stigma, the shame, the embarrassment, the everything that is attached with that, or associated with that. And I think this is where it comes to employers or organizations that are doing gender-based awareness training within your organization. How much depth are you going into, and which perspectives are you looking at, and are you including sources and resources both internally and externally where people can get help? And we've seen from the work that we do where sometimes employees don't want to reach out to the internal resources, like, for example, an ICAS or whoever your service provider is, for that fear of, not being confidential, the shame, etc. So it's about giving your employees options to say, this is available to you internally. If you don't feel comfortable using the internal support structures, these are the external support structures: Power, SADC, Lifeline, etc. And but the most important thing is that you get help, and how can we provide channels for you to get the access, to get the help that you need. And men are definitely a part of that. And this comes to going back to our upbringing from a society point of view, from a gender stereotyping perspective, that men don't talk about these things. We don't raise it with men. It's seen as a weakness, and men don't really know what tools or what they have access to help them deal with aggression. And aggression is just a form of expression of what deeper things that are going on underneath there. You know, I always use the analogy that underneath tears is hurt and pain, and underneath anger is hurt and pain. It's the same expression, same emotion, we just express them differently. So I think we've covered pretty much everything holistically. Cole, over to you, and maybe opening up the floor if there are any questions.
Yeah, I think are there any questions for Paula and Diana? And Liesl is also on the line. So if you have thought of any other questions that you want to ask Liesl, please feel free to ask them. All quiet. Oh, there we go. There's a question.
Garen. Oh, hey. Hi, Garen. Good to have you on the call. So for those of you that don't know Garen, he's actually head of the Movember Foundation. We do quite a bit of work together under men's health in particular, mental health as well.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, Paula, I think, you know, you've touched on the topic, and it just highlights that from a Gbvh perspective that, you know, firstly, there's a misconception about gender stereotyping, that gender-based violence can be inflicted on men as well. And also just with that stereotype with men not dealing with mental health issues in terms of aggression and expression in a positive manner. So, you know, we're working tirelessly to address that issue as a charity and an organization, and working with organizations to identify and realize that men are very much a part of this, and global programs that we've seen with rehabilitating men in the space of Gbvh and dealing with mental health issues, particularly with the predominantly high rate of suicide and depression, you know, is very key. So, you know, to that point, and you know, the lack of knowledge that there is around men's health and mental health, you know, we're looking forward to a summit that we're hosting. You know, many few people know that, you know, June is actually Men's Health Awareness Month, and starting to address that and to destigmatize these issues. You know, we're opening up that conversation. So very key to that. We're looking forward to a summit that we're hosting on the 17th of June, just to address those topics.
I think that's awesome, Garen, and definitely much needed. There are very few resources out there aimed at men specifically when it comes to dealing with mental health issues and Gbvh issues. I think this is a great start. And if you can share the details, you know, of that summit, I'm sure Cole will pass it on to all the people that have joined the call today.
Yeah, with pleasure, we'll do that. Paula, and there's some more questions in the chat.
Sure, let me see. So this is for Liesl. Given the fact that mental health side is a huge area of focus, what would the FirstRand wellbeing teams be reviewing the current policies in place?
Thanks, Karen. I see your question. I think you might have joined a little late this morning because we actually went through a bit of a presentation in terms of what we have been doing at FirstRand. So absolutely, we have been reviewing our policies. We've implemented a gender-based violence and harassment task team. And as part of that work, we've created a full library of resources on the intranet page on the wellbeing site. So accessibility and ambassadors, etc., are all available within the FirstRand sort of landscape across all franchises. So perhaps just to access the intranet site for more detail, and if there are any further questions, welcome to take that offline if there are any specifics.
Just adding on to that, Liesl, for anybody that's on the call, we are recording the session and it will be uploaded onto the Business Engage YouTube. I do know that some people did join later. So if you want to access the information and you joined a bit late, go ahead and go and you know, listen to the recording afterwards.
Perfect. Thanks, Cole.
Liesl, I think this next question you can give your perspective on as well, because I think you guys have experienced this or have policies in place. What is the support that we can provide individuals that have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, especially with them working from home?
Mm. Yeah, so this is quite a broad question, and and obviously each individual case is assessed on its merit. But I think from a